let me ask you something, and I want you to really sit with it for a moment. Is there anyone in your life right now who is quietly destroying your peace, and you're the one rolling out the red carpet for them? You answer their calls immediately. You say yes before you even check in with yourself. You put your needs on hold again and again, and somehow you've convinced yourself that this makes you a good person. In my consultations, I often see people who are exhausted, anxious, and emotionally empty, yet deeply proud of how much they give. And this is the part no one warns you about. Sometimes the very traits you were praised for, your kindness, your generosity, your selflessness, are the same traits slowly eroding your mental health. Today, I want to talk to you about that uncomfortable truth. I want you to think for a second. How many times have you said yes when every part of your body was screaming no? How many times have you stayed quiet when something hurt you deeply, just to avoid conflict? How many times have you sacrificed what you needed so someone else wouldn't feel uncomfortable? And now, the hardest question of all. How many of the people you've sacrificed yourself for would truly do the same for you? Before you assume this is just another self-help message, let me be very clear. What I'm about to share is not theory. It's what I've seen over decades of clinical practice. I've sat across from people with enormous hearts kind, loyal, generous people who are anxious, depressed, chronically resentful, and emotionally depleted. And when we explore their history, the same pattern appears again and again. They confused being a good person with being endlessly available. What most people don't realize is that no one ever taught them the difference between genuine kindness and emotional intelligence. No one told them that you can be a deeply good human being without giving yourself away in pieces. And so they learned, often very early in life, that love must be earned through compliance, sacrifice, and silence. Here is the core problem. When you give from love, you may feel tired, but you feel full inside. There is a quiet sense of alignment. But when you give from fear of rejection, fear of being disliked, fear of abandonment, you don't feel fulfilled. You feel drained, empty, sometimes even bitter, and then guilty for feeling that way. In the brain, this matters. Your nervous system cannot tell the difference between emotional rejection and physical danger. To your brain, saying no can feel like a threat. So it learns to protect you by making yes automatic. And over time, that automatic yes becomes your identity. But kindness without discernment is not virtue. It's self-erasure. And in the next part, I want to show you exactly how this pattern is formed, why it feels so hard to break, and why being too good is not a personality flaw, but a survival strategy that once made sense and now is costing you dearly. In my consultations, when we trace this pattern back far enough, it almost always begins in childhood. Not because your parents were cruel or intentionally harmful, but because certain behaviors were rewarded and others quietly discouraged. You were praised when you were easy, when you didn't complain, when you shared, when you adapted. You were loved when you were agreeable. And when you expressed anger, frustration, or needs that inconvenienced others, the response changed. Maybe it was disapproval, maybe withdrawal, maybe subtle disappointment. But your nervous system noticed. This is something no one explains to you growing up. Your brain is a learning machine. It doesn't care about truth, it cares about survival. And it learned something very simple. Being good keeps me safe. Being difficult puts love at risk. So your brain adapted. Your prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for decision-making, began working alongside your amygdala, the brain's alarm system. Over time, saying no became associated with danger. Not logical danger, but emotional danger, rejection, abandonment, conflict. And because the brain prioritizes avoiding threat above almost everything else, it created an automatic response. Say yes. Keep the peace. Don't rock the boat. Now you're an adult, but that program is still running in the background. That's why, when someone asks you for something you don't want to give, you feel a tightening in your chest, your heart rate changes, your thoughts race. There's an urgency to relieve the discomfort. And the fastest way to make that anxiety disappear is to say yes. Your brain gets a brief hit of relief, safety restored, but relief is not peace. Relief is temporary. And afterward comes resentment, exhaustion, emotional depletion. This is the cycle that slowly burns people out, not in dramatic ways, but quietly, day by day. I remember a patient, Nora, 42 years old, successful by every external measure. She came to me because she couldn't sleep and felt constantly anxious, yet she kept saying, "I don't understand. My life is good." As we explored her days, a pattern emerged. She woke up early to care for everyone else. She was the one who always said yes at work, the one who organized everything, the one friends leaned on at all hours. And when I asked her when she rested, when she was cared for, she looked at me blankly. That question had never existed for her. She believed she was generous, but what she was really experiencing was fear. Fear that if she stopped giving, she would stop being loved. This is the painful truth. There is a vast difference between generosity and self-abandonment. True generosity is chosen. Self-abandonment is automatic. One nourishes you. The other slowly erodes your sense of self. And here is something deeply important. Real kindness is selective. Your time is finite. Your emotional energy is finite. Your nervous system cannot give endlessly without consequences. People with emotional intelligence understand this instinctively. They know where to invest and where to stop. But if you were never taught this, you were left defenseless. There is something I need you to hear very clearly, because it may change how you see your relationships forever. The people who truly love you do not require you to disappear for them. They do not need your constant sacrifice to feel secure. The ones who do are not drawn to your heart. They are drawn to your availability. In clinical psychology, we often talk about emotional dynamics rather than good or bad people. Many of the individuals who drain you are not intentionally malicious, but they have learned, consciously or unconsciously, to rely on others to regulate their emotions, solve their problems, and absorb their stress. And people like you, people who struggle with boundaries, become their preferred source. What most people don't realize is that emotionally manipulative individuals have an extraordinary sensitivity to kindness without limits. It's almost like a radar. They sense who will overextend, who will explain themselves, who will feel guilty for saying no. And once that pattern is established, it rarely stops on its own. I often explain this to patients using a simple metaphor. Think of your emotional energy as a battery. Every conversation, every favor, every time you suppress your own needs uses some of that charge. Healthy relationships recharge the battery. Unhealthy ones drain it. The danger comes when you give indiscriminately, without noticing who replenishes you and who leaves you emptier every time. There are common patterns I see again and again. The chronic crisis person. There is always an emergency, always a disaster, always a reason they need you now. You listen for hours, you give advice, you offer resources, but nothing changes because their distress guarantees attention. Then there is the critical caregiver, the one who constantly comments on your choices, your appearance, your decisions, always framed as concern. And you accept it, because confrontation feels worse than self-doubt. And then there is the most painful type, the person who is never there when you need them, but expects you to be endlessly available for them. These dynamics thrive on one thing: your fear of being seen as selfish. Here is the uncomfortable truth. When you never say no, you are not being kind. You are avoiding your own discomfort. And avoidance always has a cost. I once worked with a man who had spent years financially rescuing his brother. Every month there was a new crisis. When he finally said no, his brother exploded. Accusations, guilt, emotional blackmail. For months, my patient felt like a terrible person. But something important happened. Without a rescuer, his brother was forced to face reality, and eventually their relationship changed. It became more respectful, more honest. Because boundaries don't destroy real relationships. They expose fake ones. In my years of clinical practice, I've noticed something deeply troubling, yet rarely discussed. People who are too good don't just feel tired, their bodies begin to protest. Chronic headaches, unexplained fatigue, digestive issues, tightness in the chest, shallow breathing. These are not random symptoms. They are often the physical language of emotional suppression. What most people don't realize is that the nervous system keeps score. When you repeatedly silence your own needs to keep peace, your body stays in a low-grade state of stress. You may look calm on the outside, but internally, your system is constantly bracing. Over time, this becomes your normal, and that is dangerous. I often tell my patients, burnout does not come from doing too much. It comes from doing too much of what betrays you. There is also a quiet loneliness that develops. You may be surrounded by people, constantly needed, constantly contacted, yet feel profoundly unseen. That's because no one is actually relating to you. They are relating to the version of you that never refuses, never complains, never asks. And when that version collapses, when you finally say, "I can't anymore," people are shocked. Not because they didn't notice your exhaustion, but because they assumed it was endless. This creates what we call relational invisibility. You are present, but not perceived. Useful, but not known. Another hidden cost is resentment. Many good people deny this, but it always emerges eventually. It leaks out as sarcasm, withdrawal, emotional numbness, or sudden anger that seems to come out of nowhere. In reality, it has been accumulating quietly for years. Resentment is not a flaw in your character. It is information. It is your psyche telling you that something is deeply unbalanced. And then there is the existential cost, the most painful one. Over time, you lose clarity about who you are and what you want, because your decisions are always filtered through other people's expectations. You don't ask, "What do I need?" You ask, "What will cause the least friction?" That is how people wake up one day feeling like a stranger in their own life. This is something no one warns you about. Being endlessly accommodating slowly erodes your sense of self. I remember a woman in her late 40s who once said to me, with tears in her eyes, "I don't even know what I like anymore. I just know what everyone else needs." That sentence has stayed with me for years. But here is the truth that brings relief. This pattern is learned, and what is learned can be unlearned. If you feel a wave of anxiety just imagining yourself saying no, there is a reason for that, and it has very little to do with the present moment. In psychology, we understand this as conditioned fear, rooted in early emotional experiences. In my consultations, I often hear variations of the same childhood story. Love was conditional. Approval came when you were helpful, quiet, agreeable, or mature beyond your years. When you had needs, they were ignored, minimized, or labeled as selfish. So your nervous system learned a powerful equation very early. Connection equals compliance. As a child, this adaptation was intelligent. You did what you needed to do to stay emotionally safe. But as an adult, that same pattern becomes a trap. What most people don't realize is that every time you consider setting a boundary, your brain is not reacting to your current partner, friend, or colleague. It is reacting to the memory of emotional loss. The fear is not they'll be annoyed. The fear is I will be abandoned. This is why guilt feels so intense. Guilt is the emotional residue of early responsibility. You were trained to manage other people's feelings. So when someone is disappointed, your body reacts as if you have done something wrong, even when you haven't. I often explain it this way. Your mind knows the boundary is reasonable, but your nervous system doesn't feel safe yet. There is also a deep fear of being perceived as bad. Many overly giving people grew up with a rigid internal rule: good people are selfless. So asserting yourself feels like a moral failure, not a healthy choice. But this belief is false and harmful. Healthy adults can tolerate disappointment. They can survive a no. Only emotionally immature or manipulative individuals collapse or retaliate when boundaries appear. And that reaction tells you far more about them than about you. I once worked with a client who practiced saying no in session, literally out loud. Her hands would shake. Her heart would race. This wasn't weakness. It was trauma memory being activated. Over time, as she experienced that relationships did not end when she protected herself, the fear softened. Her nervous system learned something new. This is crucial. Confidence does not come before boundaries. Boundaries create confidence. One of the biggest myths about boundaries is that they require confrontation, conflict, or emotional hardness. They don't. Boundaries are not walls, they are filters. They clarify what is allowed, not as punishment, but as protection. In clinical practice, I encourage people to start small and boring, not dramatic declarations, not long explanations, simple, neutral statements. I can't help with that this time. I'm not available tonight. I need some time to think about it. Notice how these sentences don't justify, defend, or apologize excessively. That is intentional. What most people don't realize is that over-explaining is a form of boundary collapse. When you give too many reasons, you invite negotiation. And negotiation is where guilt triggers get pulled. Emotionally healthy people respect clarity. Emotionally dependent ones push against it. There is a pattern I warn my patients about. When you begin setting boundaries, people who benefited from your lack of them will often react in predictable ways. Some become confused. Some become angry. Some suddenly accuse you of changing or being selfish. This is not evidence that you are doing something wrong. It is evidence that the old dynamic is breaking. Pay attention to who adjusts and who escalates. The people who care about you may feel disappointed, but they will adapt. The ones who only valued what you provided will resist, guilt, or punish. This is how boundaries reveal the truth of your relationships. There is also an important internal boundary that rarely gets discussed, the boundary with your own inner critic. That voice that says, "You're being mean," or "You should just do it." That voice is not your intuition. It is internalized conditioning. And it must be challenged gently, but consistently. I often give this exercise after setting a boundary. Instead of replaying the conversation, ask yourself one question: did I betray myself? If the answer is no, then the discomfort you feel is growth, not guilt. And this is the part that surprises many people. The guilt will come first. Relief comes later. Always. Because you are teaching your nervous system a new rule, that self-protection does not lead to abandonment. There is a quiet transformation that happens when you stop overgiving. It is not loud, it is not dramatic, but it is profound. At first, there is space. empty space. And for many people, that feels unsettling. When you are no longer constantly managing others, fixing problems, or anticipating needs, you may feel oddly unneeded. That sensation can feel like loss, but it is actually the beginning of presence. In my practice, I often see this moment mistaken for loneliness. But it is not loneliness. It is withdrawal from emotional overfunctioning. Your nervous system has been accustomed to being activated all the time. Calm can feel unfamiliar before it feels peaceful. Then something important happens. Your energy returns. You sleep more deeply. Your body softens. Your thoughts become clearer. Decisions feel less urgent, less pressured. And slowly, you begin to notice your own preferences again. What you enjoy, what drains you, what feels aligned. This is the reconstruction of self. Your relationships change too. Some fade quietly, some become more honest, and a few, the right ones, deepen. These are the relationships where you are valued for your presence, not your sacrifice, where love does not require exhaustion. There is also a new kind of respect that emerges, not just from others, but from yourself. When you honor your limits, your self-trust grows. And self-trust is the foundation of emotional stability. I want to be very clear about something. Choosing yourself does not make you selfish. It makes you sustainable. You cannot live a healthy life on emotional depletion. This is something I say often in consultation, and I will say it to you now. You are not responsible for managing other people's emotions at the cost of your own well-being. If you recognize yourself in this message, start gently. 1 boundary. 1 no. 1 moment of self-respect. That is how change begins. And over time, you will notice something extraordinary. The people who truly belong in your life will remain, and you will finally have the energy to meet them as yourself, not as a role you were trained to play. End.